And on this week's In Focus session, we will be discussing how change is the only constant in life and how being in transition is one of the most natural things that happens to us. And the reason I say that is because we're fully in autumn now. And autumn's actually my favorite season, not just because my birthday's in autumn, but because it's just very pretty. It's very beautiful. Like, I've been going out and taking the dog for a walk this week, and it seems like autumn's really kicked in this week. Like, there's a lot of leaves on the floor. You look around, there's a lot of greens and yellows and golds and browns, and it all looks very beautiful. Like, it's such an amazing season in terms of the way that it looks. But you could also look at autumn as like this season of death and decay, because the leaves falling off the trees is because they're dying, they're decaying, right? The trees are trying to shed what they can so that they can survive the winter. It could be seen as this really like awful season because like there's just so much bad and decay and death around, right? But actually, like, the way that I like to look at it is that autumn's this really beautiful season, and the colors that we experience and the beauty of it is because of the change that's happening, is because of it being in transition, right? It's not this ugly season because, oh, summer's coming to an end and winter's going to be here soon. It's a really beautiful season because everything is in change, and that change and that transition between the seasons is what is causing the beauty that we see all around us. Like, it's, for me personally, it's one of the most picturesque seasons there is. Like, there's this particular tree that I drive past quite often. It's this huge tree, and it's got these massive branches, like full of green leaves in the summer. But when it comes to autumn, like, you can literally, if you drive past that tree every couple of days, you can almost witness the changing of the color from, like, one side of the tree is green and the other side of it will be red. And then slowly the rest of the tree becomes red with it. And it's just such a beautiful thing to witness. It's like, I don't know if you've ever like walked through a park or driven down a road that's like lined with trees, and you can just stand back on that pathway on that road and just look straight ahead at you and just look at all the colors that are around. Like, there's just so much beauty in the transition of nature. And I think if we can start to look at the transitions and the change that we go through in our own lives with the same lens, that there's so much beauty in the change, we really become comfortable with the idea of change or transition. Like, I used to be someone who really used to hate the idea of change. I used to hate the idea of transition. Like, and there's always so much that changes in our lives. Like, it could be a job, it could be a relationship, it could be the style of clothing that you wear, it could be your taste in music, your taste of food, like there's just so much, like your haircut, like there's just so much that changes, right? And I used to be really scared of change. I used to always want everything to be the same. I used to like the permanent, like, or having this idea of things being permanent in my life, and this idea of permanency in my life. But what I realized I was doing by trying to cling on to permanency or things being permanent in my life, I was actually creating a huge dissatisfaction in my life, because nothing is permanent, really. Like, everything in our life is pretty temporary. Everything in our life has its own season, just like autumn, just like spring, just like winter. They're just temporary seasons that in time they pass and they make way for something new. Like, autumn right now is making way for the winter so that the trees and the plants can survive the winter and then can go into spring and they can start to like spring and blossom again. That's a pretty beautiful thing, that nature is literally willing to shed its own beauty in terms of its leaves so that they live bare throughout the winter, so that it makes room for more growth in the spring. And sometimes in our life, we really neglect the fact that when we're going through some sort of change or transition, and sometimes it can be really subtle and sometimes it can be really obvious, like a new relationship or a new career path or a dramatic new haircut or something like that, right? It can be a really obvious transition. But more often than not, that transition is making room for something new to come into your life. And I think that's a really beautiful thing to admire about life. Like, life shouldn't be about just trying to push away change and trying to fight it off. Because when you try and constantly fight off and push away change, you create the dissatisfaction in your life. Because change is always happening. Transition is always happening in our life. And if you're constantly trying to fight it off, you're constantly creating a feeling of dissatisfaction because you're not happy with things changing. But if you're able to accept change for what it is, you can become a lot more satisfied with what's happening in your life. And I remember like when I started to really understand how impactful and how natural and how constant change is in our life, I became so much more grateful for everything that I had, because I started to see everything in my life as being something that was not permanent, i.e. it was temporary, right? And if something's temporary in your life, you can either take two approaches to it. One approach can be that you're not bothered about it because you know it's not going to be there for very long. Or on the other side of it, you can become really grateful and appreciative of that thing being in your life when it is, because you know that it may not be in your life forever. This is true for relationships. This is true for things that you own. This is true for jobs. This is true for especially when you go on holiday. Like, the reason people appreciate going on holiday so much is because they know that they're in this place that they're not going to be in forever. So they really want to appreciate the time that they have in that place. And because of the temporary nature of being on holiday, people tend to get the most out of being on holiday. And this can really be true for anything else in your life. If you're willing to see that we're always going to be going through change, we're always going to be going through or having some sort of transition happening in our life, you can really start to appreciate the things that you do have. It's like our body's always changing. Like, the cells in our body are constantly changing. Emotions are always changing. In fact, I read something once that said that if you look at the word emotion, it literally means in motion, i.e. that your emotions are always passing, they're always fleeting. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, because we forget that. We think that the emotions that we have are permanent. They're like a permanent scar on us, or they're a permanent visitor, but they're not. More often than not, they're temporary. And when I say more often than not, I mean all the time, because they are. Like, no emotion is permanent, right? Every emotion is a temporary visitor in our lives. And if you can really allow something as simple as an emotion to be a temporary visitor in your life, you will learn to appreciate the emotions that you do get to experience, because we have this huge broad spectrum of emotions as human beings that we can experience, which create such a beautiful and colorful life. But if you're not willing to allow them to come and go and to appear and to arise and to be temporary visitors in our lives, then you're constantly going to be fighting a battle of trying to change your emotions. And that sounds a lot more exhausting than just being like, oh, I'm feeling sad today, or I'm feeling happy today, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm frustrated, or I'm joyful, or I feel loving. Like, it feels a lot more easy to just like acknowledge what it is that you're feeling, and that's it. Like, allow the feeling to come, allow it to go. And the reason that I say this is because, like, this time of year in autumn really reminds me how beautiful change is. Like, change is one of the most beautiful things that we have in our life. Like, the fact that things are always changing and evolving and growing and transitioning is a huge thing to us. Because if we really can understand that that's what's always happening, what happens is you stop these thoughts that you have of trying to fight off change or fight off things that you don't like, and you allow them to be there, knowing that they're going to be temporary. And when you drop all of this thinking that you have of like needing to fight this, not wanting to, I'm not comfortable with that, or whatever it is, right? The dissatisfaction goes with it. And when the dissatisfaction goes with it, you're left with space within you. And what I've noticed in my own life is that through the space that you have left, what often arises through that is more compassion, is more gratitude, is more appreciation, is more love, is more joy, is more peace. Like, these wonderful experiences of life that we wouldn't allow ourselves to be having if we were constantly trying to fight off this idea of change. Because it is a constant. It is something that's always going to happen in our life. It is something that's always going to be present in our lives, in terms of the transition is always going to be present, because we're always going through change. As much as nature is always going through change, as much as autumn is not a a permanent season. It's a temporary one that is making room for something else. The same thing is happening in your life. Anything that is appearing to you as being a change or a transition in your life right now is making room for something else in your life. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, because if you drop all of the thinking that you have around this stuff, you allow space and you allow room for the balance to address itself, for the transition and the change to address itself, much like nature does. Nature allows the balance of the seasons to address themselves according to the temperature that is happening. When the temperature drops, autumn sets in. When the temperature begins to rise again, spring sets in, and the trees and the plants begin to blossom. And they make for very beautiful seasons because of that, because they are seasons of transition. So if you can see these moments and these periods of transition in your own life as something like a season, you're going to find a lot more appreciation in them. So I'd like to invite you to have a think about, like, what is one thing in your life that is changing right now? And I'd like to invite you to send me a DM on Instagram at I am Alex Manzi, and let me know what that one thing that is changing in your life right now. I'd love to hear what that is, and I'd love to hear what you got from this episode. And if you feel like there's someone that you think should really listen to this episode, then be sure to send it to them. Send them the link or a screenshot, because it's really important that we continue to spread messages like this. We continue to spread episodes like this. You know, I started this podcast because I wanted to make a positive change in the world, and you can also be a part of that by sharing this episode with someone you know today.